Hello class, welcome to the week 7 online discussion. This week we're going to be going over psychology of crime. If you remember the last time we met, we discussed biosocial factors of crime, where we discussed nature versus nurture, and we came to the conclusion of nature via nurture. So this week we're going to be transitioning more into how psychology has to do with crime. These are your objectives. You can pause them to read them over. There's going to be quite a bit of history and found the original foundation of psychological theories, but I will not focus on those. I'm going to focus more on how these theories are related to crime. But I will give you time during the week for you to read over the foundations and historical context of these psychological perspectives. So I'm going to be focusing more on the last 3 bullets, and I'm going to quickly go over the first 4. So let's go ahead and get started. So psychological theories are different than sociological theories of crime because they're going to focus on the influence of individuals' experiences or their emotional adjustments, as well as on their personality traits and types. So we can't talk about psychology without talking about Sigmund Freud. So Sigmund Freud originated psychoanalysis, which is founded on the perception of resistance used by individuals when therapists attempt to make them conscious of their unconscious. And an individual's behavior is presumed to be related to 3 aspects of his or her personality. That's going to be the ID, the ego, and the superego. And anxiety serves as a defense mechanism, and the unconscious are also key components that we're going to look at. So there's a good 2 pages dedicated on this in the Scram and Tibbetts text. You should definitely review, along with the section on August Acorn. And Acorn is a well-known psychoanalyst psychoanalyst who tried to apply psychoanalysis to criminal behavior. And he attempted to apply this method to uncover the unconscious motives of juveniles engaging in delinquent behavior. And he distinguished between what's called manifest and latent delinquency. Manifest delinquency results in antisocial behavior, while latent delinquency is when the same state of mind exists but has not yet expressed itself in such behavior. So after Acorn, we have Hans Eysenck, and he developed a theory that linked personality to criminality. Often discussions of this theory emphasize that human personality can be viewed in 3 specific dimensions, and this is seen in the Penn model. He developed the Eysenck personality questionnaire to measure individuals on these 3 dimensions, and this questionnaire is here on the right side of your screen in table 7.1. So the first dimension is psychoticism, right? Individuals considered to have high psychoticism are associated with being things like aggressive, cold, egocentric, impulsive, unempathetic, creative. While individuals with low psychoticism are characterized as being empathetic, altruistic, peaceful, and generally more pleasant. So that was the first dimension. Now looking at the second dimension, which is extroversion. Extroversion is going to be associated with traits of being social, lively, active, assertive, sensation-seeking, carefree, while the opposite, which are introverts, are going to be characterized with the opposite types of traits like being passive or cautious, maybe even shy, right? So most individuals are not necessarily exclusively extroverted or introverted. Instead, their personality dimensions and associated traits are more, on a continuum, with the majority of individuals being somewhere in the middle of the 2 extremes. Then the last dimension is neuroticism or instability, which is linked with such traits like anxiety, depression, guilty feelings, low self-esteem, tension, irrationality, shyness, moodiness, and emotionality. So Isaac explained that individual differences in criminality could be understood in terms of biology, and he had 3 arguments. So In an effort to explain these differences in criminology, he offered the arguments of genetics, Pavlovian conditioning, and neurophysiology. So, in terms of genetics or heredity, Isaac drew on data collected from twins, and we've discussed twin studies before. And he stated that these data demonstrate beyond any question that heredity plays an important and possibly a vital part in predisposing a given individual to crime. This type of assertion, however, is what made many critics distrustful of Einstein's conclusions. The second argument, Pavlovian conditioning is an essential part of his biological explanation, which is that socialized and altruistic behavior had to be learned, and that this learning was mediated by means of Pavlovian conditioning. So the newborn and the young child have no social conscience and behave in a purely egocentric manner. They have to acquire a conscience through a process of conditioning. So the argument was that it is more difficult to condition extroverts than introverts. In addition, he also maintained that classical conditioning is associated with moral behavior, referring to various studies. Einstein argued that conscience is a conditioned reflex. The last type of argument was initially based on brain physiology. Now, before we jump into Kohlberg, there's one last thing to keep in mind about Einstein, and it's that extroverts are characterized by a low level of cortical arousal. To achieve an ideal level of arousal, extroverts need more excitement and stimuli in their environment, and he also said that they are less susceptible to pain and punishment and experience less fear and anxiety. Now, Einstein's model of personality and criminality has received some mixed support. For example, individuals scoring high on psychoticism are often linked to criminal behavior regardless of the methodology that's used, whether it be self-report among the general population or offender samples. Now, compared with the general population, neuroticism is higher among criminal offender samples. When employing self-report methods, though, extroversion is usually higher among the general population, but not among criminal offender samples. So now we're going to discuss Lawrence Kohlberg and moral judgment. So moral development occurs in stages according to Kohlberg. Moral judgment involves in children in a 3-level progression, each level consisting of 2 stages, and that is in table 7.2, which is right here. So we have the pre-conventional level of morality, and it's characterized of designating what is considered right and wrong. We have stages 3 and 4, which is the conventional level of morality. And this is, considered where normal adult approaches are used to maintain the family and social order. And at stage 3, the individuals begin to understand and live by the principle of the golden rule. They appreciate such acts as generosity for those in need, for forgiving those who do wrong. And stage 4, these values of justice are expanded to the social order, such as establishing good citizenship, instilling a strong work ethic, and following laws of society. Now, stage 5 and 6 are going to be post-conventional level of morality. So here I linked 2 videos on Kohlberg's stages of moral development. That's a good explanation. And the actual table that I just previously showed you is also justifications for what's called Heinz dilemma. So Heinz dilemma is also linked at the bottom, and it's also explained on page 173 of the Scram and Tibbetts text, explaining the situation that one individual went through and how the theory of moral development could be applied to it with these 6 stages. So remember, go back to this slide, look at these two videos. They do a good job of explaining how Kohlberg stages of moral development work and how they're applied, and then look at this YouTube video for Heinz's dilemma, so that you could understand what this table is trying to convey. So next order of business is John Bowlby's attachment theory. Now, the development of attachment theory is was done by Bowlby and Ainsworth, which we previously discussed. I'm sorry, we didn't discuss Ainsworth, but it is Bowlby and Ainsworth, and the roots of Bowlby's interest in studying separation are, in his early childhood and in his clinical experience while training as a psychoanalyst, prior to World War II. So both researchers were influenced by the work of Freud. Sigmund Freud is a pioneer here, and other psychoanalytic theorists. So in discussing attachment theory, a reference is often made to research examining the effects of separation on mother and infant monkeys. So Bowlby cited this research and noted that these types of studies show plainly not only that the attachment behavior of young non-human primates is very similar to the attachment behavior of young children, but that their responses to separation are very similar also. And Bowlby maintained that this theoretical perspective has seven essential features, and here they are bulleted: specificity, duration, engagement of emotion, course development, learning, organization, and biological function, which are all explained in detail on page 175 in the Scram and Tivit's text. So, for example, in terms of engagement of emotion, the researchers discuss emotion of fear, right? So, in the presence of a trusted companion, fear of situations of every kind diminishes. When, by contrast, one is alone, fear of situations offer fears of situation of every kind is magnified. So, since in the lives of all of us, our most trusted companions are attachment figures, it follows that the degree to which each of us is susceptible to fears turns in great part on whether our attachment figures are present or absent. So, Bowlby's interest in early parent-infant interactions evolved from his clinical work with young offenders, and his theoretical framework evolved from this actual framework. Now, Bowlby developed a classification procedure to distinguish the various character types, and he did this in one of his studies, which was a study titled 44 Juvenile Thieves. And in the 44 Juvenile Thieves, he stressed the importance of studying the mother-child relationship, and it was a study conducted from 1936 to 1939 in which he assessed and treated 88 children between the ages of 5 and 16. So of the 44 juveniles in a study, 14 were classified affectionless, 13 as hyperthymic, which are children who tend toward constant overactivity, and 9 designated as depressed. So again, this goes hand in hand with, or directly more with psychology. And it's more of a psychological perspective. So I have incorporated here a video discussing psychotherapy and the views of John Bowlby. Now, when we discuss IQ and criminal behavior, it's important to keep in mind these names that we've already seen, Binet and Simon, right? We've discussed in the last chapter or the chapter before. They developed the IQ test. We've also discussed Terman, and we've also discussed Goddard. Remember, Goddard was the one that brought the intelligence testing to the United States. He translated and adapted Binet's model to study immigrants who were coming into the United States. He also came up with the terms feeble-mindedness, right, and specified the different levels of feeble-mindedness, being the moron, the imbecile, and the idiot. He also did the Kallikak family study, which is considered one of the major contributions, to the menace or threat myth considered to be linked to feeble-mindedness, as well as to the eugenic prescriptions suggested to address such problems of poverty and crime. So that's a little recap on IQ and on criminal behavior. So it's also important to keep in mind that, between the late 1800s and early 1900s, several researchers did conduct intelligence tests to prisoners and boys in reform schools. In one particular example, in the early 1900s, the Ohio Board of Administration was convinced that more than 40% of the juveniles incarcerated in the state reformatories were definitely, quote unquote, feeble-minded. In addition, the board maintained that it was folly to try to reform these juveniles because they were not immoral, rather they were unmoral. So there were critics, however, of such research and the subsequent findings. We have Edward Sutherland, who is well known in criminology, and he maintained that the intelligence tests administered were inadequate and that there were too many variations of such tests. He also maintained that delinquency is associated more with social and environmental influences than with IQ or intelligence. So he would have definitely have been a positivist. So we're going to discuss now Wilson and Herrnstein and their contribution to this field. So they wrote a book titled Crime and Human Nature. And they looked over a good amount of criminological studies that examined the influence of genetic and familial factors on criminal behavior. And they looked at different perspectives over time, the liberal, the conservative perspective of crime. But we're not going to get too into that right now. But something that they did look at was that they maintained that there had been an overemphasis on sociological explanations of criminal behavior. So this is the way they put it. The existence of biological predispositions means that circumstances that activate criminal behavior in one person will not do so in another. That social forces cannot deter criminal behavior in 100% of the population. And that the distributions of crime within and across societies may, to some extent, reflect underlying distributions of constitutional factors. Perhaps the simplest thing to say at this point is that crime cannot be understood without taking into account individual predispositions and their biological roots. So these researchers, Wilson and Herrnstein, they attempted to explain street crime by demonstrating how human nature develops and evolves from the interaction of three particular factors. And those factors are the social environment, family relationships, biological makeup, which is going to be considered the most controversial of these factors. Now, when we're discussing these factors, I'm going to focus on the biological makeup because I said earlier that this was the most controversial aspect. So they stressed that this theory was not one of predestination. Instead, they argued that the question of whether criminals are born or made is a poorly phrased sentence or phrase. The word born is going to imply that some part of criminality may be due categorically and permanently to assign constitutional factors like genetics, where the word made implies that some aspects of criminality may be due categorically and permanently to social factors. So they maintain that such a viewpoint neglects, obviously, the complex interactions that exist between those two causes. Now, the researchers contend that at any time a person can choose between committing a crime and not committing a crime. So think of rational choice. The consequences of committing a crime consist of rewards and punishments. The greater the ratio of net rewards of crime to the net rewards of non-crime, the greater the tendency to commit the crime. Furthermore, constitutional factors such as intelligence and impulsivity can influence an individual's ability to judge future and immediate rewards and punishments. Therefore, aggressive and impulsive males with low intelligence are at greater risk for committing crimes than are young males who have developed the bite of conscience, which reflects higher cognitive and intellectual development. Now, as you guys have seen, especially with your critiques, every single study or theory may have some criticisms. So there are various criticisms of this theoretical perspective, and one is that they fail to empirically test their terms, such as ratio or rewards. They did not adequately operationalize these terms, so this makes it difficult for researchers to actually test their theory. Another concern was a focus on street and predatory crimes, things like murder, robbery, and burglary. So they didn't include other offenses like white-collar crimes. So while it is a good theory and it did contribute to the subgenre of psychology and crime, it does have its limitations or its criticisms. The next thing we're going to look at is psychopathy and crime, right? So David Lycan distinguished between the terms a sociopath, and psychopath. A sociopath is going to refer specifically to antisocial personalities attributed to social or familial dysfunction, where a psychopath refers to individuals whose antisocial behavior may be a result of a defect or abnormality within themselves rather than in their rearing or socialization. Um, so Hervey Cleckley argued that psychopaths are intelligent, self-centered, glib, superficially charming, verbally shallow, and manipulative. In terms of emotions, these individuals lack essential human characteristics like empathy and remorse. Behaviorally, psychopaths engage in irresponsible behavior and they're going to be prone to seek novelty and excitation, and often engage in moral transgressions or antisocial acts. So here is a good Venn diagram of the difference between the two, and the reason I put this is because the two terms are often used interchangeably and they're not the same thing. Now, when we look at the research on um, psychopathy has considered it as one construct, um, and I'm here. So it's looked at psychopathy as being a part of one construct. So other studies in the literature have thought that there's possible subtypes or subgroups of psychopathy. So one group is consistent with Cleckley's um, original concept of primary psychopathy. So this is an individual who displays certain characteristics that are maladaptive and pathological, as well as key traits that appear ostensibly adaptive or at least non-pathological. Another group, uh, um, another subgroup also has many of the same maladaptive traits as the primary psychopath. However, this subtype of secondary psychopath seems to be more prone to exhibit extensive symptoms of psychological turmoil and emotional reactivity. So these individuals tend to be more reactive, antagonistic, and impulsive. They are also more at risk of engaging in self and other destructive behaviors such as drug use or abuse, suicidal gestures, and interpersonal aggression. So I'm going to stop here for part one, and I'll continue in 1 minute.